Hey boys and girls, Larry wanted to read you another story. He insisted that we wear these mustaches because we're going to read Moosetache. Is that right, Larry? You like this story? Okay. Moosetache. Moose had a problem, a horrible, hairy, prickly problem. It grew right below his nostrils and just above his upper lip. A moustache! Kind of looks like you, Larry. Now, not a few spare hairs or shy little stubble. No more weak, wandering whiskers on the upper lip of this moose. No, siree, Moose had a big, bushy, bristle, mighty moustache, but a moustache that was a blurry, slurry, mangly mess, and it itched a lot. Sure, he plucked and he tweezed. He even climbed, snipped, and teased, but his combs were still cowards, and his brush rebelled. His scissors simply surrendered. Moose was in a frizzy tizzy. The moustache was completely cramping his style. He was a great hoofer, but he could barely bop and hip-hop with a moustache going flip-flop. He was a wonderful chef, but he simply could not flambe his souffle with all of those whiskers in his way. And he was a darling skier, but how could he downhill race with that mighty moustache blowing in his face? Moose had to do something, and soon, but what? After days and days of much serious thought, Moose got an idea. He crossed some hair here, he crossed some hair there, and he tied his moustache around his neck. A moose scarf seemed to be the ideal answer to his problem. It was so simple, so easy, so perfectly perfect. But then his moustache got knotted and mangled and horribly tangled, and those hundreds of hairs still prickled and tickled. Worse, Moose could barely take a breath with all that moustache wrapped around his neck. So Moose untied, unwrapped, unknotted, and gulps in some fresh air. He got another idea. He parted some hair this way, he parted some hair that way, and he heaped all that moustache on top of his head. Moustache antlers seemed to be the ideal answer to his problem. It was so simple, so easy, so perfectly perfect, until some squirrels came, and one was a very nosy squirrel. He moved right into the Moose Motel. They huddled and hoarded, frowned in, burrowed in. Needless to say, it became quite crowded up there on Moose's head, and heavy and messy. And very, very noisy, the squirrely chitting and chattering, squeals and squalls, while Moose every morning before the crack of dawn. And that gopher was giving the moose one hairy headache. Moose needed his sleep. He needed his rest. He needed his privacy. Moustache antlers? Nuts, said Moose. No. He unparted and unpiled, untwisted and untied, and said adios to those hairy horns. But now what? What, Larry? What can he do now? I don't know what he's going to do. The miserable moose took hold of the hunk of hair, and he wrestled it, then roped it. He tethered, tied, and a moose tail! Now this was so simple. That was so easy. This was not so perfectly perfect. Talk about a dizzy do! Moose didn't know if he was coming or going, backward, forward, this way, that way. He didn't know which end was which. Moose had a bail on his tail. And so he thought, and he thought, and he thought, and he thought some more, but no other idea was a worthy winner. Braids were a bother, a moustache sweater too sweltering. Net? Not? Poor Moose. His problem was truly terrible, unbearable, just downright sad. He felt so alone, he didn't know what else to do. Then, call it fate, call it destiny. But one day, Moose tripped on his moustache and just had no time to duck. Ooh! Pardon me, they both said as they bumped. Then they blinked and they stared and their hearts went thump, thump. She was a moose. Well, it was just plain old big on her head. Hair after hair piled higher than high, a skyscraping dew of glorious curls, a tower of swirling twisters and twirls. She was simply splendid, absolutely superb. Of course, Moose had to ask how she did what she did with such a do. Miss Moose winked and then whispered, "Just a little glue." So she helped him fearlessly plunge a hoof into a fat pot of white gooey goop, and carefully, oh so carefully, they glooped and they plopped, they pasted and they pressed, they coaxed and they curled, every twirling unreally wayward whisker. Around and around they tweaked and they twirled those horrible hairs until Moose's once mangled mess was now a wondrous, winding wave of marvelous moustache. Moose gazed in the mirror and smiled a broad, mosey smile. He was so happy, so glad, so giddy with glee. He looked dashing and handsome. Moose gushed, "Is this really me?" With not one care for her hair, the moose pair boogied and bopped. They skied downhill, even uphill, and their cooking was so hot, hot, hot. So, of course, it wasn't long that Moose and his Moosetache and his beautiful bride fox-trotted and tangoed and waltzed down the aisle. Good hair days, bad hair days, they vowed to love and to cherish, and with hearts heaped with love and pots filled with goop, they both signed, "I do glue," and promised to never be apart. So it was simple, so easy, so perfectly perfect, and it stuck like glue. There's a baby moose. We hope you enjoyed our Moosetache story.